Hey guys, welcome back to Sports Betting Truth, and I am very grateful to be here after the weekend I had. But today we're going to get right back on track here at Sports Betting Truth, continue our baseball series, and today we're going to talk about preseason ratings. That's right, preseason ratings. It's a necessary. You got to do it if you're going to have a good model. If you followed my college basketball progress last year, especially early on in like late November, early December, you would have seen, if you followed me, that I tried to run my college basketball model with 2 weeks worth of data in the season with no preseason ratings. And I ran the outputs, and right that I was like, can't do it. You got to have preseason ratings. You got to do it for every sport, not just baseball. Very necessary for any sport that you're modeling for. Trust me on this one. And I'm going to go into more detail about this right here in a second. This might be the most important video of the series because you have to have good preseason ratings. It's just a requirement. If you don't, you're not going to succeed. So without any further time wasting, let's get into it. All right, so I'm going to start this video off by just going through a quick presentation to kind of explain what preseason ratings are. And before I start this presentation, I do want to say that this can apply to any sport, not just baseball. I do the same exact stuff for college football and college basketball, so this can apply to other sports, but just for the sake of this video, I'm going to talk about it from a baseball perspective. So preseason ratings are necessary because first and foremost, you need them to fill in gaps until a large enough sample size has been built up. A lot of people say in baseball, I'll just let them play the first couple months of the year and then I'll build a model and then enough games have been played so then I can just use the stats then. Well, that doesn't work because there's a lot of players, like for example rookies, who don't get called up until the middle of the season. And then you have players who start the season on the injured list who don't start playing until June or July. They're not going to have anything to go off of. That's why there's always a revolving doors of players, even in September at the end of the year, that don't have a big enough sample size built up yet. You need to have preseason ratings for everybody to fill in those gaps. Trust me on this one. You can't do that. It doesn't work. Yeah, there's a lot of players who do have a big enough sample size by the time July or August roll around, but there's plenty as well who do not. Number two, you need to give each team or player a mean to regress to. That's the ultimate purpose of preseason ratings, is that every player has a mean that they're going to regress to. Mike Trout is going to have a higher mean to regress to than some rookie, right? So that's another reason preseason ratings are so important, and I think that's the ultimate end game of preseason ratings, not just to fill in the gaps, but to give each player a different mean to regress to, because you can't regress every player to the same exact mean. Everyone needs a higher or lower starting point based on their past history. And last, the idea of a model is to forecast and not summarize. If you're just waiting for a big enough sample size to be built up and then just using that data, you're not forecasting. You're just summarize what has happened up to that point, and then you're just going to take what has happened up to that point as your forecast. Well, the idea of a model is that you forecast and not summarize. You're trying to predict what's going to happen going forward, not so much summarize what has already happened. And that's why you still want to keep each player's preseason rating into his stats even after he's built up a big enough sample size, because still you need to account for the past history, give a player to regress to, forecast things going forward. So those are the three main reasons preseason ratings are necessary for any model. And why don't you just use Picada, Zip Steamer, etc.? People have asked me this before. Well, one, those systems are all designed for season-long fantasy baseball, not betting. Two, they do not output splits. If they do have splits, they don't show them publicly. I'm not even sure if they have them. Splits, when I say splits, I mean like left versus left, right versus left, left versus right, home and away, all kinds of different ways you can split out a player's stats based on situation. All of the stats that they output are just general, season-long stats with no splits or anything. And lastly, they output what they expect their stats to be, not percentages, not versus league average. And I think, in my opinion, you need to do all preseason ratings against the league average for each season that you're going backwards in for year-to-year trends. And using the league average, I'll cover this more later in the video, but using the league average is very important because it's a safeguard against rule changes. For example, if in basketball, if they move the three-point line back, well, that's going to cause everyone's stats to go down. But how do their stats compare against the league average? Because the league average three-point percentage is going to go down, but if Steph Curry hits 30% of his threes and the league average is 25%, I'm just going off the cuff here, he's 5% over the league average. But if they move the three-point line back and now the league average is 20% and he's hitting 25%, his Yes, his three-point percentage went down, but he's still 5% above the league average. That did not change. That's using against the league average, which I covered in my last video, keeps things consistent. It's a safeguard against rule change, and that's what you use to do preseason ratings. All right, so there's 3 different ways I do preseason estimates. And I believe each of them is good, and each of them has their pros and cons, and it's up to you to decide which of the 3. You can do all 3 if you want. You can do 1 of the 3 to include. Now, last year, all I did was the weighted baseline. I did not do anything else. And all things considered, it's not bad. By itself, it's not terrible. If you're just going to pick one, I would probably pick the weighted baseline because I feel like it's not terrible. It's not going to be the most accurate, but it's going to get you in the ballpark. So the pros of the weighted baseline, before I go through the pros and cons, what the weighted baseline is, it's basically what I do in my baseball model, as well as in basketball and college football, I do 4 years because that's an entire recruiting class, but it's a 4-year weighted average of each team, or in baseball, players' stats. So Mike Trout, what's a weighted 4-year average of his home run percentage, his double percentage, his strikeout percentage, walk percentage, all that against the league average? How does that trend with the more recent seasons getting more weight? Now the pros, it's very simple to execute. It's not hard to do a 4-year weighted average. You don't need a lot of math skills to do that. You don't need a lot of fancy software or anything like that. And number 2, you don't need more than 3 or 4 seasons worth of past data. You don't really need to go back that far. But the cons, it's slow to catch on to short-term trends. So if a player gets off to a bad start or gets off to a hot start, the weighted baseline is going to be slow to catch up to that. There's no right way to account for nonlinearities. When I mean nonlinearities, say a player misses an entire season. So what are you going to do to fill in that gap of the season that he missed last year, or the year before that, right? How do you account for rookies who've only played 1 season? Do you use 100% of his first year, or do you use a synthesis of maybe his first year and maybe like the average trend of second-year players? What do you do? And number 3, getting the right weights is a guessing game, The way, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. One way to do it, 65% for the most recent year, 25% for year 2, and 15% for year 3. Or wait, no, 60% and then 25 and 15. That's a way to do it. But is 60% too much? Is it too little? It's a guessing game. Like I said, there's no right or wrong way. So the weighted baseline is what I use. I used it all 100% last year in my baseball model, and it makes up 1/3 of my model this year. It's good. You don't need a lot to go, and it gives you a good starting off point. The idea of a baseline, not just in baseball but in any sport, is each player has like a baseline that they're going to go off of. Like Kansas in college basketball, their baseline probably indicates they're probably always going to be playing at a high level. Alabama in football, if you use their 4 or 5 year weighted baseline, it's going to usually indicate they're going to be at a higher level than a team like Troy in the state of Alabama, who's not bad for a Sun Belt team, but you get the idea. The baseline, establishes a baseline for every team or player. All right, moving on. Now we have linear regression. Now, with linear regression, I'll show you more in detail after the presentation, but linear regression is you pretty much take a database of all the players in the past and how their stats change from one season to the next based on certain criteria, right? Like if a player had these stats and was this age, at this age, how did he do the next season? How did his stats change? Not what were his stats the next season, but how did his stats change year over year? That's very important. You don't want to use the actual stats, but you want to use the year-over-year change for this. And then you just apply the year-over-year change to his stats last year. So the pros. It requires less data wrangling and structuring. You just need to get a good database in there that you can regress off of. It doesn't require any complex layers of data or anything like that, or cleaning or structuring. It's pretty simple. You just need to find the features you want to use, maybe what his age was, what the stats were in the previous season, and then you use, those are your X variables, and then your Y variable is going to be how did the stat change in going into the next year. Number 2, you can factor in many features, including categorical variables like age, height, and all kinds. There's no limit to your features, and you can use p-values and stuff to do feature selection to determine which features matter and which don't. And then number 3, conservative forecast. So from my experience using linear regression for preseason ratings in every sport, it gives you conservative forecasts. When I mean conservative, there's not going to be that much change year over year. You're going to get some change, especially with drastic things like in college football and basketball, percent of starters returning in football or percent of minutes returning in basketball. You're going to see more less conservative forecasts when those numbers are at extremes. But for those in the middle, things don't change really much year over year. All right, and then the cons. It requires knowledge of linear regression. So you got to have knowledge of how it works and how to do it. Not everyone does. Number 2, you got to go back a lot of seasons to have a big enough database for this, to have a large enough sample. You want to regress ideally off multiple seasons, going back as far back as you want to get data for. I go all the way back to 2008 with mine. And number 3, conservative forecast. That can be a pro, but it can also be a con. Because it's conservative, it is not going to really rock the boat too much year over year, but that might not be able to catch on to players who might have a breakout year or a year where they take a big step back. So that's linear regression. I use it too. I use it in all 3 sports. It's good, but like I said, it's good for conservative. It's kind of like the yin to the yang of some other methods out there that are going to give you a little bit more variable forecasts. All right, and then finally we got nearest neighbor analysis. To explain what this is, it's a form of clustering where, think about like if you go to baseball reference and you click on a player's page, you're going to see something called similarity scores. And similarity scores is how you identify a player to his most similar other players that have played baseball. Think about giving every player or team a fingerprint, and you're trying to find players or teams in the past that were most similar to that player and how they fared. Like linear regression, you're trying to find out how they fared in terms of their stats changing year over year, not what their stats were the next year, but how they changed from year to year. So that's what it is. It's a fingerprint. Nearest neighbor analysis is what I base my ATM models that you've seen in college football and college basketball off of. Those are nearest neighbor models. I create a fingerprint of every team, and then I try to find similar teams in the past, or in baseball's case, a fingerprint of players, and try to find similar players in the past to trend off of. So the pros. It's very flexible in ways that a baseline in regression is not flexible. So when I say flexible, it's not linear. You're not based on like a linear trend. It's non-linear, so you can find a lot of different ways to match players that may not have been matched in a regression or baseline. Number 2, you're matching players with like players instead of regressing an entire database. So that's why linear regression is so conservative, because you're regressing an entire database. But with nearest neighbor analysis, it's kind of like regression, but you're filtering down the database to only include players in the database that are similar to the player at hand. So that way you can get more of a customized fit for the player when you're trying to find players in the past to trend off of. And number 3, variable forecasts, meaning they're not conservative. They're a lot more variable, so you can get a wider range of outcomes. And then the cons, it requires a ton of front-end effort to structure all of this. The linear regression and baseline is pretty easy, but the nearest neighbor analysis took me like an entire day, if not 2, to do, because you got to take every season's past data and structure it. You got to normalize the data. You got to split out the data in all different kinds of ways. It takes a lot of front-end structuring. Number 2, you have to narrow down a certain number of important stats used for fingerprints. So if you use all the stats that you'd use in like a regression, for example, you're not gonna get good matches, because the more features you have in a nearest neighbor analysis, the less reliable your matches are going to be, because there's just too much to match off of, and everyone's going to kind of migrate towards the center, right? So what you want to do is you got to select just a certain number of features when using nearest neighbor analysis to match off of. That way your matches are actually identical or similar matches, and not just whoever was like closest to the mean, because the more features you have, you're just going to regress to the mean and not actually get a good set of matches. And number 3, variable forecasts. That can be good and bad. It's kind of like the yin to the yang of the linear regression. They complement each other, and that's what nearest neighbor analysis is. All right, so that's it. So I'm going to go into my model folders and kind of show you what I do. So here's my spider. I don't have my player projection system script open because I only use it before the season. There's no need to use it during the season. So let me go into my PPS folder. And PPS stands for player projection system. This is what I call, this is like the baseline for batters, left-handed batters against right-handed pitchers, trending all the way back to 2008. So I have every player's year-over-year stats, home run percentage, left-handed batters against right-handed pitchers, right? So let me see if I can find any players playing this year. So like if I was going to do a baseline, I would just take, 2020, 2019, 2018, 3-year weighted baseline, give this one more weight than these two, and that's my baseline for player number 475253, who I think is Sinshu Chu. I'm not 100% sure on that, though, but I think that's who it is. No, it's not him. He wouldn't have that good of stats against lefties, but you get the idea. But that's pretty much how the weighted baseline works. I create this matrix right here of home run percentage, and that's that. Not hard. And from there on the baseline, now that I have that frame, I can then calculate a baseline. So what I do is, let me open this one. This is left-handers versus left-handers for this year, right? And so this column right here is played. And what that column represents is how many years they have played. If it's 1, it means they're a rookie and their only season in there is their only season. If it's 2, it means they're a sophomore and they have 2 seasons worth of data in there, and 3 is anyone who's played 3 or more major league seasons within my database. And that way you can, give different weights for the rookies and for the second-year players and then the third-year players. That's why you do it. You don't have to do that, but I think it's good. That way you're being reasonable with your first-year players, especially those who got called up in September and didn't play that much. You want to be able to account for stuff like that. So that's why I do that for baseline. But this is just a list of baselines for left-handed batters against left-handed pitchers for this season that I projected him out to be. So here's Sinshu Chu right here. I know that's his ID. So his baseline against left, because he's not a good hitter against left-handed pitchers. But his home run percentage is still slightly above average on the baseline. So he's not all bad, but mostly negative here. So that's the baseline. And then the next step was the regression. What I did is I just took all the baselines from the past whatever seasons and created a master frame that showed year-over-year change. So let me open this file. So this is what I used to regress off of, the master baseline bat left versus left. And in here, I also have age, I have height, I have weight, I have all kinds of things. So Bobby Abreu is the first player in this database because I go back to 2008 and I just include everyone in it because why not, right? So pre-year, that is these were his stats in 2010. So basically before the year 2011, here were his stats as a left-handed batter against left-handed pitchers. He was a 3-year player. He was age 37. And I use age as what their age was on June 30th of that year, and so on. And so basically I regress off of this, right? Pre-year. And then I merge this with the next year's stats. So here, if this is 2010, I'll put his 2011 change, how his stats change year over year. So how his stats change from 2010 in 2011, those will go right here. Those are your X values along with age and height and weight and everything like that and played. And then the Y value will be how the stats changed, right? So there you go. Here is X values. Here is Y values. I wish I could show it to you, but I do it all in Python, so I don't output it to a CSV file. And then I regress based off of that, each stat individually. And also I want to point out that these stats are all versus the league average. Like I said, that way you're protected against rule changes. Versus the league average. You can always add how their stats compare to the league average onto the current year's league average for your actual model on the back end. Always do things against the league average in the past. That way rule changes don't affect anything. But for example, if Bobby Abreu had minus 0.02 home runs against lefties at age 37, and then those are the X values, the Y value is going to be how his home run percentage change the next year, and you regress off that. So that's linear regression. And then finally, KNearest neighbors. As you can see, I have a lot of KNearest neighbors files in here. I don't even know which one to open. It was a crazy process. You have to, first of all, you have the database. So lefties versus lefties. This is probably going to look very similar to the last file I opened, and it is. But unlike the last one, this is what I actually regress off of. So this is, you can also have a better idea of how the regression works as well with this open. So this is 2010 stats right here, all the X's. Before 2011. Here were how his 2011 stats changed year over year against the league average. So his home run percentage went down 1.5% the next year after 2010. I also have plate appearance, age, and everything else. That way you can fingerprint these players. And these columns right here, this is interesting. I combine double and triples because, like I said, with nearest neighbor analysis, you're trying to reduce the number of features as much as possible, right? You want fewer and fewer features because the more features you have, the more everyone's going to be clustered together. You're not going to get any separation. So I combine doubles and triples together. Ground ball, fly ball, this is a ratio, ground ball, fly ball ratio, right? That way I'm not like using each out separately. So when I actually do nearest neighbors, I just do singles, doubles and triples, home runs, walks, strikeouts, ground ball, fly ball ratio, and age. That's the 7 features I use for nearest neighbor. And also the played column too, 8 things. But the played is more of like a filter and not so much as a fingerprint item. So when I have the database, then you have to normalize everything. You want to normalize because, for example, you want everything to be between 0 and 1. If you're doing age, for example, then if you don't normalize ages, then everything is going to be not on the same scale. You normalize so everything's on the same scale because if a player is 39 years old, then he's only 1 year away from Miguel Batista. That's pretty close, right? That falls within range. But he's only, if a player's home run percentage not normalized is like 0.04% and Miguel Batista is only 0.02, then that's 0.02%. That's very close, but really not really, right? You want everything to be in the same context. That's why you normalize all stats when you're doing nearest neighbor analysis. So after everything's normalized, you want to make sure you keep track of the min-max frames for normalization purposes, because that's how you normalize. You use the min and max. As you can see, I keep that on hand. And then the KNN delta. So Bobby Abreu, this is his KNN delta. So this is the ultimate database you're fingerprinting off of, right? So here were his stats, and here's how things changed, right? These were his stats before the year 2011, and these are how his stats changed in the year 2011. So this is what you're ultimately fingerprinting based off of. This is like the database that you're using to fingerprint with. You're basically calculating the absolute differential between every player in this database to the current player you're fingerprinting for, and whoever has the lowest differential is going to be your matches. Now, the challenge with KNearest neighbors is where do you cut the tree? That's a term in cluster analysis, cutting the tree. Like, do you use the 10 most similar matches? Do you use the 20 most similar matches, 100 most similar matches? And if you use whatever X number of most similar matches, do you use a weighted average? Like, does the most similar match get a higher weight in the overall mean of these matches than like the last match in the sample? These are things you have to ask yourself. What I do, I use a weighted average, and I think I use the most 15 similar matches in a weighted average. So the most similar match gets a higher overall input into the final mean than the match number 15. And then finally, the final output is what I put in. I call it the ATM file, and this is your final output, right? So right-handed batters versus right-handed pitchers. And what these numbers represent, year-over-year change. Here's how the KNearest neighbor analysis forecasts these players' stats to change in the upcoming season. So, for example, who has the highest home run percentage here? Player 621-439. We expect his home run percentage to change 5.8% higher than what it was last year. I think that is. I actually don't know who that is. I think it's Juan Soto. No, is Juan Soto? Let's look. We can always look. But that's actually pretty high. We expect his. Whoops. So while I'm waiting for this to load, I was working on my model today, and I was just like, there's so many overs, and everything is way over, right? Way over. And I'm like, why is everything so over? Like 1.7, an average of 1.7 runs above the posted total. And I was like, why is it like this? And then I found out I was still counting runs in my Monte Carlo simulation, even with 3 outs in the inning. So that's why. So I fixed that. That's why you always test your model. Rigorous testing. Don't jump in right away. But anyway, I'm trying to figure out who this player is. Byron Buxton. You know what's awesome about this? Is look at how awesome he's been this year. Look at how he's hitting .432 with 5 home runs already. And he was not that great up until that. He hadn't lived up to his potential up until this season. And my KNearest neighbor analysis caught on to that. Look at that. He had the highest expected home run leap and home run percentage of any player in my KNearest neighbor database. And he has delivered on that. I didn't even know that until I did this video right now, right? Isn't that amazing? Who's this? I want to find out who this is. But yeah, at least my KNearest neighbor for him nailed it. Ronald Acuna Jr., another one. Yeah, We expected his home run percentage to leap by 4.2%, and boy, has it. He's already hit 7 home runs, and I think he leads the National League. So at least the first 2 players in my KNearest neighbor right versus right database have paid off. So that's the benefit of KNearest neighbor analysis that you don't see as much in regression. But then I take all 3 methods and I combine them all together into this frame. So projected pitchers right versus right 2021. Here you go. Here are all the projected player stats against the league average this year, right? That's what it is. Who has the highest strikeout rate projected? Well, 5.94.798. I think that's Max Scherzer. Let's see if it is. No, it's not. That's too low of a number. It's Jacob deGrom. So, yeah, Max Scherzer has a lower number like this one right here. I think that's him. But the higher the number, the more recent they started in the league. So that's the projected pitcher preseason ratings versus the league average. So we expected Jacob deGrom to have a strikeout percentage about 12.9% above whatever the league average is for right-handed pitchers against right-handed batters. That's how it works. But you're probably wondering, how do you forecast rookies, guys who haven't played? If you really wanted to, you go into the minor leagues and you use minor league stats to forecast. If you really wanted to, but I don't. I just create a generic rookie frame. So I take all the stats of rookies in the past and I just create a generic baseline of rookies average in the past, right? So rookie batters, right versus right. This is what it is. It's a weighted 3-year average of past rookie stats, and it's really not that complex. The average right-handed rookie against right-handed pitchers over the last 3 years had the home run percentage at basically 0. A singles percentage slightly below the league average. A strikeout percentage is significant, about 1.1% above the league average. A walk percentage a little lower. I mean, I think this all makes sense. And I split it out by batter and pitcher. There you go. That's how I do rookies. So that's pretty much how I do preseason projections. I don't just do it for players. I also do it for home advantage. It's a 3-year weighted average. That's pretty much it. Nothing special, but here's a 3-year weighted average of home advantage. I had to be a little special. I had to give a special weight to 2020 because of COVID and not playing in front of fans. I also do park factors, preseason projection for park factors, errors, fielding percentages, max pitch. So what's the max pitch frame is the maximum number of pitchers throw and starts and in relief appearances. That way you know when to pull pitchers in a Monte Carlo. Some pitchers have a higher maximum pitch count than others. You really want to do that because of openers. I hate openers. As a modeler, I hate openers. When I say openers, I mean a starting pitcher who only pitches 2 innings before being pulled, right? That's another reason to have a max pitch frame. League averages. You want to do league average projections. Number of pitches. So the num pitch frame is the average number of pitches a batter sees in an at-bat and a pitcher throws in an at-bat. Who's more selective, who's more of a free swinger, who throws more strikes, who throws more balls. That's why you do that, right? So it's not just limited to player or team stats. You want to project everything. But that's pretty much the basic of how I operate my preseason projections for baseball. I hope that I could maybe not show you how to do it because that's not the point of these videos, but to at least give you an idea of my process, how I think, and some concepts and ideas that you can apply going forward. Pretty high level stuff, as you can see, but like I said, it's required. It's required if you're going to have a model. It just is. Preseason ratings. Yeah, you can let sample sizes build up enough, but trust me on this one, it's just you got to be able to fill in those gaps somehow, and the gaps are always going to exist, especially in baseball. Maybe not so much in a sport like NBA, but in baseball, since it's a player-based sport more than a team-based sport, you got to do it. So anyway, that wraps up this video. We got another video in the series coming up. Next time it's about projection methods, how to simulate games or give yourself projections for the games. You've structured all this data. You've come up with the preseason ratings and the splits and the frames and everything else I've told you to do so far. So how do you put it all together and come out with a prediction? Well, that's what the next video is going to cover, so stick around. Until then, this is Sports Betting Truth, signing off.